Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Philip Goldberg. Philip has been studying the world's spiritual traditions for more than 45 years. He is the author or co-author of some 25 books published in more than a dozen languages. His book, American Veda, was named by Huffington Post and Library Journal as one of the top 10 religion books of 2010. It was followed in 2018 by the popular biography, The Life of Yogananda. He blogs on spirituality and health and co-hosts the Spirit Matters podcast. He also recently published the book Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. And we talk about a number of topics from that book today. I hope you enjoy the episode. All right. Well, so Phil, it's been 4 years, I think,
Really?
since we did
Wow.
our last episode. Yeah, I was just looking at the number, and it was episode 17 that we talked last time, and now we're at episode 120.
Wow,
So
getting up there, man.
getting up there, yeah. This when you keep doing it, the numbers just keep going up, I suppose. But we had a great conversation before. But of course, a lot has happened since then. You've written two books. Well, maybe you've written more than is it two books you've written? You wrote the one in 2018 on Yogananda,
Oh,
and then
right. So when I was on last time, it wasn't about Yogananda. It was okay.
yeah, it was 2016 that we did the interview, and I think
Oh, okay.
we talked about spiritual pragmatism, we talked about appropriation, and then we talked about
Yes, yes, right.
topics related to what you'd written in
Right,
American Veda, which of course had been, published for quite some time by then, but we
right.
talked about that. So, yeah, so I want to cover a little bit of the content of those two books, but talk
Great.
mostly about your most recent book, which is, of
Yeah.
course, incredibly timely,
I
called
know. Everybody
Spiritual
says
Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. I mean, it doesn't get. Uh,
doesn't get crazier.
and you wrote it before COVID came out. Am I right?
Yes. And
So,
that's the fun part that people keep saying, "Oh, what great timing. You're brilliant." Like I
yeah, I mean, it seems like you kind of saw it coming. Maybe the meditation practice, the spiritual practice that you're teaching in that book, led you to
uh,
cultivate some
maybe.
cities.
Yeah, right. I was prescient.
yes,
I,
absolutely.
I've been joking with everybody that it's the first time I ever had a book that was that was timely. I've usually been ahead or behind the time.
Well, yeah, you've definitely focused on historical moments and historical figures, and I'm actually interested in kind of what inspired you to switch tracks and focus on a practice book. But before we get there, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what's happened over the last 4 years and what you've been up to, and then let's talk a little bit about Yogananda.
Well, 4 years. Um, the early part of that phase, I believe, if my timing is right, I was probably already at the early stages of researching the Yogananda biography.
Yeah, I think you were
Uh,
speaking about it in that episode as well. You mentioned it was on.
Possibly.
Yeah.
And then it came out in 2018. And that was a remarkable adventure
Mm,
to dig deep into the life of an important figure like him, and one who's inspired millions of people in their spiritual paths, and have been read. His autobiography of a yogi's been read by millions of people.
yeah.
He inspired me. I first read Autobiography of a Yogi in 1970. And when I interviewed people for American Veda, everybody, would say, not everybody, but uh, his autobiography was the most often mentioned book when people talk about what introduced them to their spiritual path.
Absolutely.
And that goes for, most of those people were not disciples of his. They didn't become devotees or, in any devoted way, but they were inspired by him and his books. And I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
And but it was fascinating to dig into it and uncover things that were not in his own writing. A lot is left out of Autobiography of a Yogi. I know most of your listeners are familiar with the book, probably have read it, but he leaves out a lot about his life, especially his life after he came to America, where he spent the last 30 plus years of his life, and where he became famous and did all his work. And he leaves out a lot. So I filled in the gaps, and it was fascinating to dig in. And I have to say, now to segue to the new book, when I was working on Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, I was inspired to some degree by what I learned researching Yogananda's life. And, that's a subtle thing. But last year, sometime in like the spring early spring of 2019, I started to notice people were very afraid and angry and worried and preoccupied and overwhelmed, as many of us have been in the Trump era. And I noticed people saying they were neglecting their spiritual practices, or, they had no interest in that. They were just too overwhelmed. They were too stressed out, or they were too busy trying, engaging in social activism or whatever it was. And I said, no, this is the time we need this most. Yeah. This is the time we most need to meditate. This is the time we most need whatever, sustains our spirit on a regular basis. So I wrote an article about it, and that got some attention. And my publisher, Hay House, who had published the Yogananda book, we'd been talking about what I want to do next. And I said, I'm not doing another 3-year research project. I want to do something practical and, that I can do fairly, quickly. And they said, well, maybe there's a book in that article you wrote. And we thought about it, and I did, and I realized it was needed. Yeah. And then, of course, we went through all the editing and rewriting and everything, and it was the galley proofs were being proofread while I was leading a tour in India in January and February of this year, and I came back just to look over the final galleys before they went into production, and then COVID, the lockdown happened, and now it's out. It came out in August. We rushed out the ebook, for Kindle and the other platforms back in April. So because we feel it's a contribution, it's something that benefits people in this era, and especially when the lockdown hit and things got far crazier than we could possibly have anticipated. We rushed it out, and they charged only $1.99 for the ebook version, and then the paperback and the audiobook came out in August, but we kept the ebook at $1.99. And now everybody's telling me what incredible timing I have and how brilliant I am for bringing out a book in the middle of the pandemic when it's so important. And of course, when I wrote it, no one had any idea. Times were crazy enough.
I know. It's our, just even thinking about that and how much crazier it's gotten. We look back almost nostalgically now to 8 months ago when life was so serene by comparison. It just is absolutely insane. It resonates. I love what you're mentioning about how we kind of, especially when the proverbial shit hits the fan, our immediate go-to, rather than to recognize that our spiritual practices can really ground us, is to kind of see them as a secondary thing. They're
a luxury.
I'll get to that after I handle this. After I handle the serious work of social action in the world, and so there is this kind of distinction that a lot of people have in their minds of their kind of externalized action in the world versus their spiritual practice. Can you talk a little bit about how we can see these two things as actually co-sustaining one another?
Yes, and I want to add another factor, or maybe we can come back to it. But the two things I heard most from spiritual people, or people who Oh yes, here meditation is good for me, but I don't have time for that now. I'm too busy. Or people on spiritual, or people would say, I am just too agitated now. I can't do these things that calm you down. And no, that's why you do them. You do them to calm down. It's not like it's like saying you're too dirty to shower. You know, it's not like that. I'm too sick to go see the doctor. Um, and no, it's and the other thing is, no, I'm either too busy, I'm raising my kids, I've got my career, or I'm too busy with social activism. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And this goes back for me a very long time, because I was, an anti-religious, Marxist radical kid in the 60s trying to end the war and doing civil rights work. And all the, religion and all this stuff was the opium of the people. And then when I got on my own path and, realized, my life was a mess, and my searching, led me to the spiritual teachings of India. That's when I realized, and well, I shouldn't say realized, I learned, I was taught that spiritual practice is an, a platform for more effective action. It's not an escape mechanism. It's not a luxury that, I'll do when I'm, 85 years old and retired. It's not something that you just do to tune out the world and leave it behind. It's also a platform for action. So there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita that has always stayed with me. It hit me very hard when I first read it, and it's sort of been a guiding light. And the translation is, established in yoga, perform action. Mm-hmm. So it's a two-step, I call it the spiritual two-step. It's you go within, you experience the inner state of unity. You go into the sanctuary of peace that we all have within us. And it's healing. It's a refuge. It's self-protection. It's a temporary tuning out so you can tune in to your own inner wisdom, your own best self, true self. But then you come out. We're human beings. We have lives. We have responsibilities. And by doing spiritual practice first and then acting, your actions are more effective. You have a clearer mind. You make better decisions. Your intuition is sharper. You're coming from an expanded heart and a deeper sense of perception of the world. I saw that happening to me just, as a personal experiment, verification of that back when I was a young seeker. And it's been verified in my life and others over and over again. And when people tell me, they think spirituality is incompatible with social action and social justice world, I always say, yeah, well, tell that to Mahatma Gandhi. Tell that to Martin Luther King. These were deeply spiritual people. Tell it to Jesus, I mean,
If you can get a hold of him.
Yeah, right. I mean, these were deeply spiritual people who were driven into very effective action to make the world better.
Yeah.
I mean, Buddha had his enlightenment. He didn't stay under the tree. He came out and did what he was called to do to help other people. And this spirit of acting from a deep spiritual place to serve is, you find that in every spiritual tradition. There are very few, hermits. There are monks and nuns, but the overwhelming majority of them do service work in the world. And so I always tell my activist friends, you'll do it better. You'll do your work better if you protect yourself, you also won't burn out and get overwhelmed as easily, but you'll also, make smarter decisions. I'm a sports fan, and when I was young, an athlete, and I always wanted to be the athletes I admired the most, the ones who, when the pressure's on, when the game is on the line, they're the ones who take charge. They're the ones who, they're not only good at what they do, but they don't lose their cool. Mm-hmm. They stay centered. They stay stable. They keep their wits about them when the, pressure's on. I always wanted to be that guy, and I wasn't. But when I watch a basketball game or something, those are the ones we admire. But that the same thing is true of, soldiers and business executives and, parents and, politicians, social activists. When the pressure's on, you want, there's a lot at stake. You want to be centered. You want to have a calm place. You want to have what the Gita calls equanimity.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting, all of those examples that you mentioned, especially athletes and whatnot, is that all of those figures, all of these athletes didn't just show up to the game without having some kind of prior preparation. They forged themselves in the fire of practice, and
beautiful. That's right.
And I really liked what you pointed out in the book about, I had never heard this before, about something that Gandhi had said that, which it brings to the point of, I have so many things to do. He said, I have so many things to do today. I'll meditate 2 hours instead of one, which really flips it on the head and makes you think. And I think anybody who's engages in deep spiritual practice realizes that actually you discover more time. It's really quite miraculous. I mean, time is just not linear in that way. And maybe it just happens, you discover more time because you become more effective at engaging in the time outside meditation. So yeah, I just thought that was a really beautiful observation.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter in the book because this is, I've been hearing this for 50 years. Oh, I don't have the time. Time as if it were spiritual practice were a luxury. Mm-hmm. And then when people look at how they spend their time, especially these days, how much time we waste, so much time.
Yeah.
That you once you see the effectiveness of a good spiritual practice, or maybe practices. Yeah. If you have a inventory of them, then you realize they're not luxuries, they're not add-ons, they're investments. They're investments of time for like regular maintenance. Like you invest a few minutes to brush your teeth. You invest time to prepare your meals and eat properly. Most of us are used to making time for exercise because we know it's good for us. It's good for our bodies. Well, some of us discover that spiritual practices are also good for our bodies, but also for our minds and our souls and our spirits, and they're investments. And I learned early on, after I was meditating a while, it was like, something would happen and I wouldn't meditate that day and I would feel the difference. Mm. It's like when you feel like, I haven't showered. Something's missing here. I haven't gotten enough sleep. I haven't eaten right. You feel it. And you know that this becomes a necessity, an important investment of time. But you have to manage your time well. Yeah. And, just fit that in. And we can always fit in 15, 20 minutes. Just spend a little less time on the smartphone.
Yeah, well, you have a good recommendation in the book. Maybe you want to share it of kind of combing through if you are one of these people, and it, it's a legitimate feeling that we don't have time, whether or not it's true. So what would you recommend for those individuals who want to find the time and want to kind of realize that they do? How can they go about, carving out some time in their day?
Two things. Do spiritual practice long enough to see the benefits, because then the motivation kicks in. This this is good for me. This works. I have to find the time for it. And sometimes people, say, okay, I'll try this, but they don't necessarily try a good, effective practice long enough to see the real benefits. The second thing is take a look at how you spend your time. I know people, business people, who teach seminars in time management. Mm-hmm. People's use of time is a big deal, and they have people, sort of keep an inventory, keep a log of everything they do and how much time they spend on it. And if you do that for a week and then look back on it, you realize how much is wasted. Yeah. How much you didn't need to do that. It happened to me the other day, and this is a larger topic of being overwhelmed by the news.
Oh my God.
And the bombardment of the media, but it also is about the use of time. I found myself the other day getting really angry at something on the news, as is easy to do these days. and then I realized afterward, that's the third time that day I got angry at the same news. Because, it was repeated on the cable channels. And I said, I didn't need to watch it the third time or the second time. Once was enough. It was a waste of time. And you realize there are things that, and a little waste of time is a great thing. We need to be idle. We need to just goof off or whatever. Not everything has to be productive. But there are things that, we don't really need to do. And you can find, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour to do it. Even if so, you go to sleep a little early, you wake up early, and, fit in your practice first thing in the morning. It's not that hard to do. You prepare the breakfast the night before. There's little ways to rearrange the time. If you live with other people, you can mutually help each other in those ways. Mm. It's something, people, and I have to be honest, people say to me, oh, it's easy for you to say you don't have kids. You're a self-employed writer. You don't go out. You're not on a commute every day. And I say yes, but I have taught meditation to people who are parents and who commute and who have high-pressure jobs. They find the time if they value it. You find the time for what you value, even if it means you do it on the commuter train, or you shut out you don't take any calls for 20 minutes in your office, and shut it off your phone and do it. There's ways to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you point out in the book is that the 1960s were arguably worse than now, with assassinations and carnage and death in the Vietnam War. But, the message seems to be, the going kind of narrative is that, we're living in the worst of times and it's just getting worse. So, what's the fine line between actually recognizing that things are not great such that I am motivated to do something to change things, versus falling victim to this this kind of overwhelming narrative of things are, going to hell, essentially, and what that belief essentially does to our nervous system when we allow it to kind of take over.
Well, there's a lot of research that shows that optimistic people are healthier and live longer and, happier. So a certain amount of optimism is good, but it's not something you can fake.
Yeah.
It's something, you could shift and try to be optimistic, but, truly being optimistic is having a sense that things can work out and maybe I can contribute to it. That feeds a sense of optimism. It's bleak out there. This is a dark time, and we're recording this in early October of 2020.
Yeah, so it might be even worse in a month.
Yeah, come December and January, when people, aren't with their loved ones for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and the weather is cold, and people, we're more vulnerable, and we can't eat in a cafe so easily. It could get even bleaker, and depending on the outcome of the election, it could be totally insane.
Yeah.
That's all true. Your comparison to the 60s is also true, that things were crazy then. I'm old enough to remember it. And I could, I would not like to make a comparison between which is crazier.
Yeah.
Each was crazy in their own way. Each was dangerous in its own way. But we came through the 60s. And, people who were a lot older than I am, who are probably not alive anymore, will tell you that the Great Depression and World War II, they were pretty crazy. And they were very difficult. And things were incredibly dark. But we come through it. And I said earlier that my working on the Yogananda book influenced writing Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. Mm-hmm. One of the things that impressed me about Yogananda was that he was a deeply spiritual man, obviously. He was a monk. There was a part of him that always wanted to just go back to India and, live in a cave or an ashram and be in his oneness of yoga with the divine. But he had a mission, and he was given this mission. He took it seriously, and so he always came back to, rejuvenated that will to go on. And he went through very difficult times, and he worked very hard. Spiritual practice was the cornerstone of his life and what he made the cornerstone of all his students' lives. But doing work in the world and doing it well, fulfilling your dharma, living up to your responsibilities was also important, because we are human incarnations. We're people, humans, men and women. And so he lived a very responsible life as the head of an organization and as a teacher responsible for students' well-being. And he did it through the Depression, through World War II. They were struggling for money all the time. They barely survived. He was a victim of racism and bigotry and, all kinds of stuff. And he spoke out. He spoke out on, about the world. He was well informed, and he used whatever platform he had to speak out against injustices in support of Gandhi and the independence movement of India at some risk. And so I admired that, and I saw, well, there's a model of a modern spiritual leader who was also engaged in the world, even though he knew the world, everything was transient and, in a certain way illusory. It was still the play that we're in. Mm-hmm. All the world's a play and we're the actors, and we have to play our parts well. And so do we. And, the last chapter in the book is about sacred citizenship and being a responsible person in the world, that being a spiritual person doesn't excuse you from the responsibilities that you take on, whether it's in your family, in your neighborhood, in your community, or in the larger landscape of being a citizen of the United States or wherever listeners are, to do whatever we can, not just in spite of being spiritual people, but because we're spiritual people. Presumably, you are cultivating through your spiritual evolution a greater capacity to love, a greater capacity for compassion and empathy. Why not use that? Make a contribution, whatever it is, however small. Not everybody is, going to be, on the front lines of protest. Not everybody's going to devote the bulk of their time to activism. It's not for everybody. Not everybody's going to run for office or, work in a political campaign or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But just, helping people in need is, valuable contribution. I'm sending letters to people in swing states through an organization to get out the vote.
Mm-hmm.
So, I spend some time writing letters and putting stamps on and bringing them to the post office. It's my way of contributing to the political landscape.
Yeah.
I use whatever platform I have on social media. And, whatever it is, in the early weeks of the lockdown, the first week, I got a phone call from a new neighbor who is much younger than I am. And he thought, oh, Phil and his wife, they're older. Maybe they need some help with grocery shopping. I thought I didn't, but that was a beautiful gesture.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of goodwill and those qualities of the heart that they make a contribution in some way. And I think we're called at this moment, to do something to make the world a better place. You're doing these podcasts. I don't know what else you do, but these podcasts are a service. They serve somebody. I have a podcast.
Yeah.
It's free. We don't make any money. But there we are. Now, the last interview, for example, was with Robert Thurman, the Tibetan Buddhist teacher. And, I just saw on Facebook, a lot of people have now listened to that. That will help them in their lives.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I've made a contribution. Whatever we do, will help.
Yeah, I agree. I love that idea of sacred citizenship. I actually am hoping at some point to do kind of an online conference. Perhaps you can come participate and essentially kind of connecting. What's the guy I interviewed him as well, who does the whole idea, talks about sacred activism.
Andrew Harvey.
Andrew Harvey, yeah. And there's several other spiritual teachers who just have really beautiful kind of contributions to make on what it is to be kind of a citizen that is motivated by spiritual principles, without projecting our own spiritual traditions onto everyone else, right? There's always a fine line in that, because it seems to me, and perhaps you agree, that there is just a disintegration of the idea of citizenship in our culture. I mean, like just the whole thing around masks and how much so many people are rejecting what just, at the very basis to me just seems like a gesture of, not, wanting to reduce harm and doing it for our fellow citizens who may be more vulnerable than we are. Maybe it's not going to stop the virus. Everyone's like, oh, it doesn't work. But it's like, it's a gesture that might, reduce, to even if it's to a small degree, the spread of the virus. And so, it seems like that the whole drama around that seems to point to this incredible loss of the very notion of citizenship in our culture. And I'm just wondering what you think kind of the causes of that are, and perhaps from the perspective of your book, how we can get to a better place.
Well, I certainly agree with you. It's not only this anti-mask thing is not only supremely selfish.
Yeah.
But it's supremely foolish, because these people are making themselves more vulnerable. And it's just an anti-science thing that seems to spring from some mistrust of what they think of as the elite.
Yeah.
That, and I don't understand it entirely, but I know part of it must be this ethic of rugged individuality, this myth of rugged individuality that Americans are prone to, that say, if we all just follow our self-interest, everything will be great, and you can't tell me what to do, and, don't tread on me. It's an anti-government, anti-institutional every man for himself, every woman for herself attitude, that's toxic. I
Yeah.
mean, American individuality and the honoring of individual freedom and everything is one of the glories of the modern world. And, it was the evolution out of feudalism and, class-based societies and autocracy. But like other things, if you take it too far, you get into trouble. So
Yeah.
now we have this shark infested world of everybody out for themselves without a sense of civic responsibility. But what's interesting is you take these angry people who say, you can't tell me to wear a mask, in the context of their homes and their families, they're probably responsible people.
Mm-hmm.
But what they define as being part of themselves is very narrow. It's
Yeah.
like me and my family.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these angry guys yelling, "Don't I'm not wearing a mask. You can't make me." They'd lay down their lives to protect their wives and children, or maybe even their extended family.
Yeah.
So they're not without responsibility in the most cases. It's just the sense of kinship to a
Yes.
larger community is somehow lost, and I can't help but think that part of it is it's built in racism.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, this virus is only affecting people of color in the poor communities, and why should I sacrifice for them? I don't know if that's conscious, but I think that could be part of it, and it's toxic and it's crazy. And I always want to say, what, wearing a mask and not being able to go to a bar, is that asking a lot? I mean, people went through the Depression and fought in wars, and this is what you think is too big a sacrifice?
Yeah.
It putting on a mask? I mean, you can even take it off when there's no one around. It's not like you have to wear it all the time. It's just when you're close to other people. It's not that big a deal.
I know.
It's like before the lockdown and everything, the pandemic started to spread in Asia when I was in India, and we were worried, about getting home and having to change airports and places, change planes in places. And I was changing my planes in Singapore, and we didn't know, what was going to happen. But everybody wore a mask just as self-protection because we were going into airports and on planes. We all had masks because the streets of India are so polluted.
Yeah.
It's not that big a deal. You just put on a mask.
Yeah.
But it's this.
Yeah, it becomes a symbol. You really unpacked it really well. I think that I love the way that you're just talking about the manner in which kind of the orbit of compassion that is available to people shrinks around, friends, family, immediate kind of community. And so I wonder if this is just something that is happening all over the world, is this kind of contraction into forms of, we might say nationalism, but it's really more than that, because it's these smaller communities. It's my party. It's, my conservative friends and relations, or my liberal friends and relations. And,
yeah.
And, it's just this increasing tribal kind of mentality that it's just backward.
It's tribal and that sense of tribalism is a sign of being locked in a very limited state of consciousness.
Yeah.
Where you feel connected only to a limited circle. And when things are tough, tribalism seems to, become more intense. It's like circle the wagons. And my experiences, and people who know a lot more than I do have, encouraged this way of thinking, that one of the things that happens when you're on a spiritual path is the deep sense of connectedness grows.
Yeah.
It's not an intellectual thing. It's not like, you read a book about, ecology, and you realize we're all connected, and you realize everything affects everybody else, and butterfly flaps its wings in South America, and everything's connected. That's an insight that's important to keep in mind. We are all connected. But there's something about the expansion of consciousness and the opening of the heart that comes with deep spiritual practice over time, that you feel the connection in a deep way. And you feel the connection to other people who are not your blood relatives, who are not your kin, who are not your, extended family. You feel a kinship. You feel a connectedness to people who are different from you in ways that maybe you didn't sense or feel before.
Yeah.
And then you also, with deep spiritual practice, you come to a place where a sense of oneness comes about, so that you realize that what you are in your essence, everything else is. Everyone else is. And so you're not just connected to other people, you are those other people in a certain way. Yeah. And that's a hard thing to grasp, but it's a felt sense.
Yeah.
That and you begin to love the diversity and respect it and appreciate it, because they're all just manifestations of the same divinity. And so just like you can, go to a garden and enjoy all the beautiful variety of flowers, and knowing they're all just, the glory of nature. Well, all these other human beings are also, the expression of the divine manifestation and all this magnificent variety. I also think, some of that is learned from your environment. I mean, I grew up in Brooklyn in a very racially and ethnically mixed world when I was a little boy. So I had, black friends and classmates and teammates and, Irish friends and Italian friends and Jewish friends. And so that kind of diversity was part of my life. Yeah, I think a lot of the tribalism now it's not so much red state and blue state, but it's urban areas and non-urban areas.
Yeah.
Because people who are in places like New York and LA and Chicago and Atlanta, they're used to diversity. They have a more ethnically and racially diverse experience of life every day. And that becomes part of their, frame of reference. Whereas people who grow up in homogeneous environments, in more isolated and less pluralistic, they may feel threatened by diversity. And I think a big part of American tribalism right now is this resistance to the inevitable, colorization of the American population, and the growing diversity that just it feels threatening to people who are not, don't have much of that experience.
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely, going back to what you were saying before, looking forward, it does feel like it might get worse before it gets better, but it does seem that ultimately, it has to get better, at least in the sense that it becomes increasingly normal, the diversity of our culture, and it's only getting more diverse. And really, the forces of globalization aren't going to stop anytime soon, as long as unfettered capitalism is ruling the world. So, I mean, really, the ethic of diversity and the ethics surrounding diversity just has to get more
Yeah.
widespread, even in those areas where people are, at the moment at least, more homogenous.
And it does. I mean, beneath all the craziness and the anger and the rage out there, if you look at people's attitudes over time, look, back when I was growing up, my parents had a friends, an interracial couple, black husband and a white wife. That was so rare. When they were together on the streets, even in Brooklyn, even in mixed, even on the subways of New York, that people stared at them. That was so weird. It was, but now, there's interracial couples everywhere. They're on television. They're doing commercials. Look at gay rights, for God's sake. When I was in college, I had, my best friend was gay, and it was a terrible thing that people might find out about that. And now, things change. People grow, and they grow when they're exposed to people who are not like themselves. It's like, when Dick Cheney came out okay with gay marriage because his daughter was gay, I mean, that was mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But he was able to do that because someone he loved so deeply came out, and that's what's going to happen. People, get to know people who are not like themselves at work or, wherever it is, and they change.
Yeah.
It's inevitable.
And just to tie it back to the conversation, we're having around spiritual practice can help that process. Am I right?
Yes. Yes. Right. We got caught up in current events.
I loved it though, because it's very relevant.
But it is. But thanks for bringing it back, because that sensitivity, that openness, and another part of it is when people, one of the benefits of spiritual practice, as I said earlier, we have a sanctuary of peace within ourselves. So you're less agitated, you have spiritual practice, you have a calmness inside, but you also have a sense of contentment. And when people realize that their happiness, their well-being, their sense of fulfillment depends on their inner state, not, what they earn and, who they hate and all the things outside of themselves, when they experience the difference between having a calm, content, open inner state and a closed, angry, narrow, agitated state, that encourages them to maintain that. Mm-hmm. And they become less dependent on what's going on outside them for their happiness. And then they feel less threatened by the things they thought were depriving themselves of the happiness. So, you're more welcoming, you're more open when you're calm and content inside. Everybody knows that. If you're agitated and upset by something that happens at work, you come home, you're going to get angry at your kid more easily than if you're happy and content. Then, the child who irritates you instead is just your adorable baby who you want to, be loving to. And it's that way with the rest of the world. We're more kind, we're more compassionate, we're more open and welcoming when we're more content inside. Yeah. And so in that respect, spiritual practice and that deep sense of kinship that, the Indian gesture namaste. Yeah. The greeting namaste. When you go to India, it's just a routine. Everybody, puts their palms together and bows, and sometimes they'll say namaste. And it seems routine. But when you think about what it means the divinity in me recognizes or, celebrates or honors the divinity in you. It's recognizing that we are all one. We are all expressions of the same divine manifestation. And the spirit of that, whether you say namaste or not, but the recognition of that grows with your spiritual practice. And that, that's one of the reasons I think it's so important for the state of the world that more and more people develop a strong, deep spiritual practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about, and maybe this is sort of can be one of our closing topics. You bring up the subject of pratipaksha bhavana, which I just really liked the way that you discussed it, because it's often interpreted as sort of like, if you have this negative thought, then just cultivate the opposite. And you point out, the very like just realistic observation that oftentimes that seems ridiculous, and like, how do I, if I hate someone, what does that even mean to cultivate love for that person? And you have a really kind of nuanced way of discussing that. So I was just wanting you to talk a little bit about that, because, after we engage in spiritual practice, presumably we're going to have these resources of flexibility, and pratipaksha bhavana seems to be something that we can then apply to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, a lot. I drew all the practices, and there are many, 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 many. It's a whole inventory of spiritual practices to use at different times, according to your needs in the book. And I drew mainly from the yogic traditions, but also from other spiritual traditions. But I also drew from scientific research, because a lot of these practices we think of as spiritual are studied as psychological therapies or physiological interventions, and we want to understand them. So there's brain science, there's psychology studies around all these things. So one of the things that comes out from the world of positive psychology and this notion of positive thinking. It's not just a yogic technique. People in the West have said, oh, no, cognitive therapy, replace your negative thought patterns with more positive ones. But how you do it and what you replace the negative thought patterns with matters. And one of the things that's become evident is that the replacement of a negative thought with a positive one is more effective if the positive one is believable.
Yeah.
Because your subconscious will pick up on it. And your subconscious will say, that's total bull. I don't buy it for a second. And but you're trying to be positive, and you're trying to love that person because you shouldn't hate, and the hate is toxic, and you're angry. So, you shift to non-anger to I'm happy and it's all is well. But if you don't really believe that, it's going to be a struggle to replace that mood or that thought pattern. And your subconscious just, it's going to just reject it. So it's like someone gave me this analogy that I use in the book. You say you're learning tennis, and you say, I'm no good at this. No, that's a bad way of thinking. I'm great, and I'm going to be in Wimbledon next year. No, you're not going to be in Wimbledon next year, and no amount of faking it is going to make your subconscious really believe that. Yeah. But if you replace it with, I'm going to practice hard and be better at it all the time, that's believable. Mm-hmm. And it encourages, positive thinking, and it also encourages good behavior, effective behavior. Similarly, if I'm looking at the television and I see, person who we won't name, and I get angry at politician A, or something happens in the world, like, and you get angry, or just, you're within your family, something upsets you and you're angry, or you can switch, but you need to switch in a positive, in a believable way. So there's a problem. And instead of, I hate this and I hate that person or anything, you can't shift to, oh, the problem's gone, it's all fine, and I love that person. No, but you can shift to, this is where I need to pay attention to this.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of getting, caught up in worry and fear and all that, you say, okay, this is a real problem. I have to attend to it, and this is what I'm going to do, and I can affect a better outcome. That is a positive replacement that can actually lead to, effective action, and it's less toxic than, being caught up in fear and anxiety. But it's not fake. It's not fake. It's a believable replacement.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really like that because not only it also seems to kind of invite a harnessing of also our imagination in the service of just seeing our own experience differently, not necessarily differently out of the scope of my current experience, but differently in actually recognizing, like you're saying, like modes of understanding a particular thought or feeling that are valid and believable for me without actually being just kind of preposterous sort of projections. So I really like that, and it seems to because just to connect it also back to spiritual practice. I mean, one of the benefits, it seems to me, especially in my experience, this has been very true in my own spiritual practice, my meditation practice, is that creativity is something that is really arises quite dramatically. I feel like a lot of embodied philosophy has arisen out of the creativity that I've experienced through my practice, and just being able to envision your experience differently. There's something about that that's very much about creativity and imagination.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think that's one of the reasons I came to value in the early stages my newfound meditation practice back in the late '60s. I always wanted to write, and I felt called to write, but I was a mess, and I could barely sit still for 10 minutes, let alone write. And one of the things that came about as a result of regular meditation practice was I had enough inner calm and presence to be able to write in a sustained way, and I was more creative and more consistently creative. And I know musicians and other people who also have that same thing. And you see it with athletes, you see it with entertainers and musicians. They may not have what they call a spiritual practice, but they have some routine that centers them,
Yeah.
that brings them to that inner calm, so they're in touch with that sort of wellspring of creativity that's always within us. They all have their unusual routines,
Yeah.
but routines they are, and they serve a similar purpose.
Absolutely. All right. So let's. I want to ask one question, which is regarding spiritual practice and those who are interested and perhaps maybe they have one or it hasn't been kind of fully concretized, or in your book you obviously offer a lot of examples and a lot of options. So what would your advice be to those who are listening, who want to, well, they're going to read your book, obviously they're going to get that incredibly well priced ebook, or they're going to order the physical book. I always prefer physical myself, but that's just
Yeah,
my
me
own
too.
predilection. So what would your advice be? Like, what do you listen to in yourself when you are seeking out a coherent body of sadhana, or an inventory of practices, as you called it before?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. There's two things I recommend, and you just put them all in one sentence. Um, a regular sadhana, regular spiritual practice that, for me, the cornerstone of which is a meditation practice that takes you deep and into that inner silence, inner calmness, that long enough every day so it sticks with you for some time. And then to develop an inventory of practices to surround a deep meditation or mindfulness practice where, things you might do before and or after, things to do during, life. I have chapters on the use of sacred space. I have chapters on the importance of relationships and as spiritual practice. And then interventions, things to do at any given moment when you need, a sort of spiritual break, when you need to access that inner peace within you, even if you only have 5 minutes or 2 minutes. And so developing an inventory is very useful. And there's a lot of suggestions in the book and guidelines for finding a core spiritual practice, a core meditation. I devote a lot of time to the nuances of meditation and the difference between meditation and mindfulness, and the difference between certain types of meditation. And I'm a big advocate of getting personal instructions if you can from a qualified teacher, and don't settle for some, magazine article or amateurish, meditation video. But to get proper instruction, because a lot of what I find is an obstacle for people is they hear meditation's good. What's meditation? Oh, you quiet your mind. Okay. And they go home and they say, okay, I'm going to quiet my mind. And they try it. And of course they can't. Yeah. And they say, well, I'm not cut out for this. I can't do this. And that they give up. And that's a common experience. And I always say to those people, if you saw people driving cars and you said, hey, I want to do that, and you'd never driven a car before, would you just get behind the wheel? No, you would get instructions. Yeah. There are ways to meditate. There are instructions. And when you learn properly, it's not hard. In fact, if it's hard, it's not a good practice. It should be easy. It should be effortless and natural. And learning how to do that requires some instruction. I should add that I created an audio recording of meditation instruction that on my website, philipgoldberg.com, you'll see if you want that recording, if you buy a copy of the book and let me know, I'll send you the recording. So at least it's, audio is a little easier than reading instructions, but there are instructions in my book as well. But finding practices that work should also be a kind of research project, an experimental project, and be objective about it. If something seems to be good, it comes well recommended, the teachers are qualified, try it. But don't just do it once. Do it for a while. See if it works. See if it makes a difference in your life. That's the test, and find what works for you. Find a constellation of practices that work for you. And always evaluate it, reevaluate it next year, the year after, 10 years from now. You change, your needs may change. You might want to, adjust your routine, try new practices. Modify old practices. There's no reason anything has to be stagnant, but take it seriously and get proper instructions, learn from reputable sources, and give these things a chance to work in your life.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're pointing these things out, because I totally agree that I think what's sort of widely out there is this idea that, meditation is really whatever you want it to be. I mean, going back to this, hyper individualistic, there's a whole kind of effect, I think, that individualism has had on, the spiritual marketplace, of course. And one of them is that, like, if it's my spiritual practice, then I just, invent what works for me. And usually that doesn't work because there are actual time-tested forms of instruction that, and also theories of the practice. This is something Paul talks a lot about, is that, people if they don't understand the theory of the practice, then it's very difficult to stay connected to the practice of the practice. And also to touch on what you said about the the receiving personal instruction from a teacher. For me, I think that the experience of receiving Diksha, or initiation into my practice, it was such an event. It was such a special moment that there's
Yeah.
something about the kind of the way that forges a new neural pathway that
Mm.
then holds you to the sustaining kind of commitment to your practice that I think we don't give enough credence to. The power of the event of receiving your practice, rather than just like picking it up on a blog post somewhere.
There's a lot of truth to that, and realistically, not everybody's going to have that opportunity,
Yeah, totally.
or value the spiritual life to the extent you do, so that really matters. But I fully agree with you, and I know that you said something earlier I wanted to comment on, and I can't remember it, but the fact that the proper instruction and the understanding what you said was the theory of it, the knowledge part, knowing what meditation does, understanding what is actually happening when you meditate. Why do I feel better? Why do my thoughts quiet down? What's going on here? What's going on mentally, physically? When I experience this moment of pure silence, what is that?
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit into who I am and what is my place in the cosmos, in the universe? Well, putting it in that framework really does help. Understanding feeds the experience, and then the experience makes the understanding come alive,
Yeah.
and they reinforce one another, and they reinforce the motivation to continue, because part of understanding the knowledge base that these practices come from is a vision of what can come from regular practice, a vision of growth and evolution of consciousness and spiritual development that is, can help motivate somebody. Oh, you feel calmer than you used to now that you do this practice? Well, can keep it up.
Mm-hmm.
There's more to come.
Yeah.
And here's what the sages have said about that, and so forth. So I fully agree with Paul, about that, and I'm sure he would agree with what I just said.
Yeah, I'm sure he would too. So it's been so delightful, Phil, to talk to you about your latest book, and a little bit about Yogananda. Your latest book is Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. Those of you who are listening, please do pick up your digital copy. It's at an insanely low price of $1.99 on
Buy
Phil's website.
gifts.
And you can get it as gifts. And then you can also get the physical copy as well. I imagine it's available on Amazon and all the usual
Yeah,
suspects.
the usual. Yeah.
All right. And then your website is philipgoldberg.com. Is there anything coming up, Phil, that you want to share with the listeners?
Well, I'm teaching a course for Hindu University of America called How Hindu Dharma Transformed America. That's just started, but you can still sign on. I have other events coming up. I had to cancel a book tour because of the pandemic, but
Yeah.
I'm doing stuff like this online. And, please go to my website. There's videos, there's my tours will one day start up again. Go to Spirit Matters,
Yes,
my
Spirit Matters, your great,
podcast,
wonderful podcast. Yeah.
and enjoy you'll find some upliftment and refuge in the interviews there. They're all free. And if you want to get in touch, you can get in touch with me through my website, get on my mailing list. I appreciate hearing from people. So, but thank you for the opportunity to do that self-promotion, Jacob.
Absolutely. Well, it's been such a pleasure, Phil. Thanks so much for agreeing to the interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.